you should hear me now, and you should see my documentary. Can you please confirm? Moody, thanks for helping out, man. Like I said, this is why I consider these lives still kind of like a beta. I was using a different, thanks Moody, I was using different software before this. Now I'm basically using OBS. Here, look at a funny, weird effect. But before this I was using something else, which was basically vMix, a terrible program. Don't use that program. Just use OBS if you want to stream. So I've switched to this. I want to go back to the documentary and show you a little bit. It's a documentary about the Filipino drug war, and I still have to tape, for example, the prologue in the studio. And somebody, Paul Steele, said I had no idea that video editing software was kind of similar to a DAW, and I'm not sure what a DAW is. So if you would please enlighten me, so I don't have to Google for it right now, that'd be great. So this is the president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, and he's been fighting a very violent drug war. And this is me in Manila. I made this trip almost 2 years ago already, and I came home with a lot of material, and I know, from just experience working in the news business, how hard it is if you have a lot of material that you don't know what to do with, sort of, that the narrative hasn't shaped itself yet. While I was standing on this square over here, I knew that I really didn't know what I was talking about. This has happened to me before as a journalist, that you have to be at a certain spot and you have to report from a certain spot, but actually you don't have the facts yet. So I came home with a oh my god, it's going to be such a monster project, and how will I ever be able to finish all of this? And I just grinded on, and I think that last April, May-ish, I started saying to friends that there was finally light at the end of the tunnel, and I still feel the same way. It's still sort of terrifying, like every creative project to release, but it's good. The way I had to solve it was basically interjecting scenes that I shot in Manila with basically videos from YouTube or stats that I found, PDFs, websites, original research, and in that way I was able to at least construct a coherent narrative about the war. It's really unfortunate because the Philippines are really awesome. I think it's unfortunate that that this is the story I have to tell about the Philippines. But I think it's very important for the global drug war that the story gets told. So in the documentary, I even include scenes I haven't released yet from Vienna. So I went to Vienna right before I went to the Philippines, and this is where they decide on drug policy. Let me see, where's the UN hall? Yeah, over here. These are the buildings in Vienna of the UNODC. It's basically where the global drug war is voted on. But there's also there are also all countries of the world, like UN members, can have an exhibition in the lobby, and a couple of countries have chosen to do so, and the Philippines has chosen to sort of sell their drug war to the United Nations, showing like, hey, we're really trying to be a good, helpful country, and we're just trying to explain how we are waging this supposedly health focused campaign, which of course it's terrible. So this is going to be in the documentary. Hi Gigi, welcome. So after the Philippines, I'm gonna have a video from an opium museum in Thailand, in the Golden Triangle, a video about Myanmar, but it's more about sort of like social development instead of opium and meth, which is the story I came for, but I was unable to. So it's really like all these stories need a lot of work to become good. And there's more of like a road trip video with me and my brother through the hills of Vietnam, where we run into these hemp fields, which is also interesting. So all of that is coming, and then intercut with more like news updates that in the beginning will be mainly about the war on drugs, but as I will be releasing, there's also going to be a documentary about Cambodia. I almost forgot, and it's about the production of MDMA precursors, as they call them, sort of MDMA ingredients, in the jungle of Cambodia, the Cardamom Mountains, which is basically a story from 10 years ago, and I went there to sort of check it out to see if it was still true. I did a live from there completely randomly, I think, because I was so amazed that we went on a motorbike for 3 hours into the jungle, and I will respond to you, Eric, in a second. Sorry, I saw your thing and I lost track. In Cambodia, we went into the jungle and we come into this open area in the jungle, and there's just perfect 4G reception. So just out of sort of like wanting to show that it was possible, I did a short live from there. Eventually, we figured out that yes, I'm spoiling all these documentaries, but that's because all 13 of you are my most faithful audience, and I appreciate you a lot, and I'm very grateful that you're here. So so maybe cover your ears if you don't want to hear spoilers, but I just want to finish the story. Turns out that there's a lot of illegal ingredients that you can get from the jungle. You can get wood from the jungle, good, very nice wood to make furniture out of, and this is what people do. Big Chinese companies as well. Or you can get some sort of weird chemical from a tree that nobody knows what it's used for, but it just needs to go to the city, and people just taxi it, literally. People taxi these substances to some market in the city, and then it goes onto the world market to become MDMA. This was only a temporary story, so that story will be much more about sort of like the impact of jungle destruction in general. And one very large part of my life in the past 2-3 years has been sort of my reappreciation of nature, I'm basically building a food forest, which is an amazing thing. It was sort of like my Corona project. I think Phoebe Bridgers was having an interview with Paul McCartney, and she said that the global consciousness was very low over the past 1.5 years. And I think that was a pretty good way of describing it. Like, I tried to go back to these projects that I wanted to do, but it's very hard to find inspiration if you have only like a few people around you. I'm not sure how you guys have experienced Corona, but there have been weeks where like everything I did was on a screen, which is super weird. I would even play VR against my brother on the other side of the world. It was a weird time. And so this documentary about Cambodia will be more about nature. A large part of my life is more about nature. And I think I see a lot of overlap in actually environmental reporting and drug war reporting. So you'll see that I basically have 3 big pillars of topics that I do in my life. 1 is the drug wars, 2 is astronomy and space exploration, and 3 is sustainability issues. And you'll see these converge more and more on this channel. So I'll never forget what my roots are, but I never want to. I also want to allow this channel to evolve. Probably makes sense. Hopefully makes sense. And it would be great if it can evolve with you. So, I mean, the fact that I'm still here, like I'm kind of amazed. It's this channel is not 5-6 years old or something. And to me, it's really like if I just keep giving it attention, like if I just focus my attention on it, like I'm doing now, like I had to force myself to do this live, not because I don't like all you guys hanging out here, but because it's a big step from doing nothing to suddenly doing this, which is it has consequences that I do this, For the conversations I have on the street, for the amount of money that I can or will or not make, for my personal development. And I think you guys must recognize that it's sometimes very easy to just do nothing and let the world slip by, sort of. And it's hard to sort of step up and become active and do things. But I think that if I just keep on grinding forward, then beautiful things will happen. Not in the show notes yet, but I've really worked on my websites, thijsroes.nl, still in its early phases, spark.sx, still in its early phases. My Patreon updates, like I've been my whole life is in Trello now, which is also good. Like I'm slowly, the big difference between now and 5 years ago is that I know I know much better what I'm doing online now. I think I was really coming out of like a blessing and a curse of my channel has always been that I started in traditional media. I was always sort of like an outlier. I was always already making online content, but a lot of my mentors work in traditional media. And I knew how to make television when I started this channel, which is very different from most YouTubers who just... A lot of YouTubers have just sprung up and all this celebrity was new to them. And for me, it was like, sort of like, oh yeah, I know. I sort of knew rationally what was going to happen, but I was unprepared for the actual experience of being a YouTuber. And then with the whole demonetization stuff, you know, I first had to conquer all these things. So, and I think I'm there now. So I'm pretty happy where I am actually today. So let's just go over the chat real quickly, and then we'll go to the news pieces. Let's see. Where will the documentary end up? Eric asks. So yes, the idea is definitely YouTube. If you have a better suggestion, by all means, please let me know. Moody asks, what about trying the country's drugs when you visit them? More interesting documentary. That's actually it's a good idea. It's interesting thought for a... Back in the day when I started this channel, I always said that I didn't want to do drugs on the channel because I was always conscious of how it would make me look and hard to be taken seriously. Then I took the channel myself into like really weird directions at multiple moments. So any principle I have from the past, I should maybe reevaluate. I think you can have a really interesting documentary about a drug without necessarily me seeing me do it, even though that will be more interesting. Like fun to watch. I understand that. I understand the appeal. And doing a certain drug always teaches me a lot about that drug. Like so much. It's essential. I think very often I have been in a situation where I didn't want to try a certain drug because I was maybe a little hesitant, or and then I tried to read up on it, and you can read so many books about crack cocaine and cocaine, but only doing them both made me realize they were both basically the same thing. And none of these books or conversations with people who used it were able to tell me these things, strangely enough. One is snorted, and crack cocaine, you can do all kinds of things with it, and that's why you need, if you smoke it or you shoot it up, you need less of it than powder cocaine. And it's so weird because powdered cocaine has a very luxurious image for some reason, you know, for rich people, and crack cocaine has such a sort of like lower status feel to it. But the feeling these people are looking for is exactly the same. The feeling they feel inside. The one is just a little bit more pronounced than the other. If you use crack cocaine, it's a little faster to come up and a little faster to go. If you snort cocaine, then it's still pretty quick. But 20 minutes instead of 5 minutes. So I'll go to the news. There's today The Lancet, a British scientific journal, released an editorial calling for the end of the war on drugs. Let me just find it. I want you to go through it. We maybe know these things, but it's good to see other people. Oh, no, not this one. There we go. Can you guys hear me? Yes, you should be able to hear me. The time to end the war on drugs is long overdue, the Lancet writes. It's apparently 50 years since the address by US President Nixon that basically started the war on drugs. By name only. If you ask me, I think actually the war on drugs started kind of like 100 years ago. I'll explain this in a second. And I just want to read a little bit from this article so that you all understand what is becoming more of a, I think it's becoming a broader and broaderly held viewpoint that the war on drugs has completely failed. But I'm not sure if the solution that they propose is the right one. So just a little bit from this article. So it is 50 years since the June 18th, 1971 address by US President Richard Nixon that publicized the US administration's war on drugs. Nixon declared that drug abuse was America's public enemy number one. Despite Nixon actually mentioning rehabilitation, research, and education in his speech, the war on drugs has been an offensive with military interventions, soaring arrest rates, and aggressive sentencing. The USA has borne a huge cost, both financially and socially, with those most marginalized and vulnerable shouldering the largest burden. 5 decades in, and despite multiple administration changes, no sign of victory can be seen. Drug use flourishes, with 13%, or almost 36 million Americans aged 12 or older in reporting in 2019 that they had used an illicit drug in the preceding month. And the goal, of course, of the war on drugs was to get it to zero, and one of the biggest failures of the war on drugs, I think, is that it just basically never makes good on its own promises. That's, its failure is so clear all the time. Certain goals are set, policies are implemented, and then drug use rises, criminality hardens, and overdoses, for example, in the US, have only kept rising, and it's really strange. So it's good to see this becoming a more broadly carried opinion. It also says the same year saw 70,630 deaths due to drug overdose, with 49,860 involving opioids. It's really, these are really mind-boggling numbers. I think it's really clear that the United States and many other countries, the UK included, don't necessarily have that much of a drug problem, I would say. They have an overdose problem. Or they don't have an opioid problem, they have an overdose problem. In essence, it's not a problem if you use opioids. If you break your leg or you have some other sort of like pain that needs to be treated, you will get opioids. And they work really well for pain. And there's a lot of people using opioids in order to function in life. So the use of opioids itself is just not really a problem. It can be a problem if you use too much, which happens, but it's also your grandma usually does not become a heroin addict after getting a pain treatment. You just stop. A lot of people just stop. The problem is that people, for different reasons, overdose. For example, they quit for a while and then use their old dose and they get too much. Or in the illegal market where they have to source heroin, their opioid. So say they don't get pain pills anymore and they still want opioids, they'll go to heroin, which can be laced to fentanyl with fentanyl. Very often it's still shot up in the United States. Something I'm very surprised by. Here in the Netherlands, I've asked the services, like how many people still shoot heroin, it's 10% of people who use heroin shoot it up. Most people smoke it, and it's much harder to get a fatal overdose smoking it than shooting it. It's much more risky shooting. So, and all these things supposedly are still controversial in the United States. This article even mentions a situation in Indiana. Let me see. Yeah, it says that here in Scott County, Indiana, there was a, as they call it, needle syringe, or syringe exchange, but you can, they call it syringe services now because they do much more at these locations than just exchange needles or syringes. They very often just have a more like holistic approach to health and ask these people like, what else is going on in your life besides the risky heroin use? So just this paragraph. With the new administration of President Joe Biden, there's a chance for a fresh approach to the war on drugs. However, Biden's record on these issues is not encouraging, and the initial signs are mixed. The priorities of the drug control policy for the new administration's first year, I'm gonna butcher that one. Encouragingly, include expanding access to evidence-based treatment, enhancing harm reduction efforts, and expanding access to recovery support services. However, local policies as well as federal will have to change. So in Scott County, Indiana, there was a well-functioning program that got cancelled by some new local government coming in because they just couldn't stomach helping people to use drugs. That's the whole thing. So, they found it so immoral to assist somebody in using drugs in any sort of way that they just canceled the whole program and then, without regard for the negative consequences of this. Let me put a little bit of light on me. So they closed it. So you can see that it's still controversial. And something else I want to say about that is that very often Portugal gets mentioned as a good example. Here again, the war on drugs must end. Our previous editorial on the topic highlighted Portugal as an example so that other countries should follow. I think it's well-intentioned and it's good, but it doesn't solve everything. Portugal has an interesting system of decriminalization, so possession of drugs is tolerated. There is basically no prosecution of drug users. There's a sort of health tribunal that you might have to go to see if your use is problematic, and if it's deemed problematic, then you can be forced into a program. Usually, if it's non-problematic use, then you don't. But this still, Portugal gets mentioned often, but it doesn't solve the market. Still, a black market, by definition, criminal market, has to supply these users, simply because governments don't want to accept the fact that people use drugs. So, Portugal is not that different from, say, Switzerland or the Netherlands in how drugs are being treated. And the whole, and it's basically the system of decriminalization. And this idea that drugs should be decriminalized for personal use is at least a step in the right direction. And I think a lot of countries are taking steps in that direction. And it's good that the rhetoric is a little more health based nowadays instead of just criminal justice based. But it's not an end solution. And it's something that the country I live in the Netherlands, makes very clear. If you don't solve... So we have coffee shops where you can buy weed in a store, yet where the weed comes from, nobody knows. You can have 1 to 5 MDMA pills on you, and generally that means that you will not be sentenced for it. You will not get a fine or anything. You can still, not get into a club, for example, if they find it on you. So, it's gotten worse a little bit over the past few years. But it's still not fully legal. It's definitely not legal. It's being produced by, again, by definition, a criminal underworld. Dutch MDMA basically supplies the world. Portugal is it's sort of this poster child for a good drug policy. It has become this poster child for a good drug policy, but it's definitely not the best thing, the best policy option that you have, because the best policy option that we do have is legalization. Now, I have to find you guys again because I lost the screen of where you guys all are. How did that happen? I want to see the chat. Here we go. So then I want to quickly jump to the United States, which has always been the instigator of this drug war. I'll tell the story of how it started in a second. But I just wanted to highlight that New York and Connecticut have recently legalized pot. Probably not news to you, all of you. I kind of just looked up. I want to go to New York soon, as soon as traveling is possible again. But I was looking up when the first dispensaries are expected, and it was kind of not easy to find. But it's planned for early 2022, so it will take another half year before you can actually toke in New York City. I just think it's going to be. It's kind of. It feels monumental to me, and especially this is Amsterdam where I am. New York used to be New Amsterdam. I lived there for a few years and feel a very strong connection with that city. And I remember, I think, visiting in 2017 or something. I lived there about 10 years ago and went back all the time. And at a certain point, I remember that suddenly I smelled weed everywhere. Anytime I would go to the subway stop, would walk, like on my walk, I would smell it somewhere. And that definitely changed. Like, for some reason, the lid was blown off. So it feels like people have felt more comfortable smoking in public in New York City already. It's happening everywhere in the US. It's really weird here in Europe because for a very long time it was constantly the Americans that hit our politicians over the head and came here to hold huge seminars for national police to basically hammer home the fact that drugs needed to be illegal. That was the sole line of the United States government. The United States government wanted to really focus on the war on drugs, and it's been doing this for 100 years now. It is this is something that's going to be in this documentary that I'm making about the Philippines, because I feel like it actually all started in the Philippines with a American missionary who came over to the Philippines because for a brief period of time it was occupied by America, or sort of like a colony of America. And while this priest was there, he saw Chinese using opium. Add a good layer of racism to how he perceived these people, and he found opium a huge problem, and he wanted to solve it. He went all around Southeast Asia to visit different countries and to log all the different opium policies that existed in Southeast Asia around, let's say, 1905. And actually in Indonesia, which was then a Dutch colony, opium was basically legal. There's so many parallels to today. For all intents and purposes, it's actually one of the few, maybe the only time that opium was fully legalized in a full system run by the Dutch government. Crazy story. Will be in a film one day. In the Philippines, that missionary went all around Southeast Asia and wrote home to the American president, opium is a huge problem here in this region. I think it's a perfect opportunity for the United States to pick up this problem as something for the world to work together on. And at this time, treaties would be done between countries, separate countries. Hardly ever would treaties be done by a huge collection of countries with the intent of making them global law, so to speak. But the United States really thought this would be a good idea for opium. So 100 years ago, it started with a bunch of opium treaties, all done by this missionary. He was the head of the American delegation. He kept on hammering on the fact that opium needed to be forbidden. And what changed in that moment, compared to any law that came before, was that for the first time, the elimination of use was part of the intent of the law. Where before this, opium had not always been legal, but it was seen as smuggled goods only. So it was very often customs agencies that would actually control any sort of fight against illegal substances. And I think that by globally pushing for the abolishment of any type of drug use, illegal drug use, and then saying like, these are the types of drugs that you cannot use, and that we will prosecute for as well. I think that has been the biggest fuel on the fire of the drug war. You can look throughout the whole 20th century and just see how that idea then evolved politically, but while always being on the books, led to what we now know as the drug war. Once it got codified in international treaties that drugs had to be illegal and with the intent of eliminating use, all these different countries started doing this. Then they updated this whole part in the 60s and 70s, many countries, usually mainly meant to include psychedelics with all of it, and cannabis for the countries who hadn't included cannabis yet. And that was then named the drug war by a war on drugs by Nixon, and later also by Reagan. And that's why in the public consciousness it feels like the drug war is 50 years old. Maybe they added a lot of fuel to the fire, but the basis, the pillars under the drug war, the ideas and the morality under the drug war all come from this one American priest who lived in Manila 100 years ago. And I strongly feel that the drug war is therefore a remnant of American colonialism, and that it's much better, it's much easier to understand in the through the lens of American colonialism, and basically a morality that was forced on a large part of the world that didn't have that morality before. So I think it's a system that we can abolish, but I don't think that you can let it crash and burn, because hardly ever does anything crash and burn. And if something crashes and burns, then usually people get hurt. So I would be all for redoing the drug list. Say, right now we're still battling over issues like, is cannabis as dangerous as heroin? And, we have to first fix those issues in these international treaties before we can, let's say there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that we can already do before we just sort of nuke the whole international order. That's I think what I'm saying. Then that is most of the things I wanted to go over with. I think then maybe it's good to focus on Europe for a little bit. If you have any questions, this is the moment to start posting them, because England is playing Denmark also in a little bit, and I don't want to keep you guys from watching that. If you give about football at all. I think that Europe is in a really strange situation now, between basically Asian countries very often fighting the drug war hard, North America and especially South America abolishing large parts of the drug war, yet keeping decriminalization as a main pillar. And then Europe is really I miss a European discussion. Individual countries have definitely progressed on things like medical cannabis or hemp legalization. They have progressed on psychedelics research, but the fact that now the main instigator of the drug war, the United States, is sort of quitting its own drug war. What does that mean for us? There have been discussions in this country here of wanting to legalize MDMA, but we will need a big political switch before that can actually happen. So I don't see it. I don't see it happen soon. Sort of. I thought about maybe I'll do that next time. I think it's sometimes also fun to just kind of like show you how I work. Like oh, that's good to mention. I'm working on a new podcast series. It's going to be a collection of conversations that I had over the past few years that I just found interesting, and now I'm repackaging as sort of like one podcast. It's older conversations, it's newer conversations about the drug war, the life and death of stars. You know, you're made of stardust. How does that happen? Rick Doblin, the head of MAPS, is in there. The Michael Pollan interview, which is already on my YouTube channel, will, for example, be part of it. So, you know, like a collection of interesting conversations with people whose story I find worthy to spread. And I'm really going to focus on expanding my Patreon page. thijsroes.nl is high on the list to be expanded. And our Patreon shout-out's still allowed. Because if you want to support me, you know where to go. So, I did my taxes on YouTube, so that's good. And super chats should be approved pretty soon. Memberships should be able to be approved. I think super chats have already been approved, but memberships might come up soon. Heroin bad, yes. A really big problem from Forever the X is that where he lives is that the MDMA is very often cut with crystal meth. That is an unfortunate situation. I would say find a better source, if YouTube allows me to say that. Here, it's almost hard to fathom because here it's super pure. In Amsterdam, I mean, it's locally made. It's a local product. Local MDMA. And maybe you can fight for testing opportunities where you live, or make sure that you always test it. And then if it's tested, tell the person you bought it from, like, hey, this is not working out for me. I'm moving on. That at least, you know, these people know, that you know. And make sure that your local government is in tune with progressive, or whatever you want to call it, better drug policy. Gigi says, in Germany I can tell you that our politicians are not educated. They just say, heroin is bad and the discussion is over. I really know what you're saying. Very often heroin is used in public discussions as if every drug is sort of heroin, which is, you know, it's as if every drug is like lethal, very addictive, etc. I think cannabis addiction is actually, we could talk for a very long time if the word addiction actually is meaningful, but I think that cannabis can be a little bit more needy of you than people usually say. But it's not as bad as heroin, because the moment you stop you use heroin a bunch of times, then you already have withdrawal symptoms, like for a week or two, say so. You can definitely have withdrawal symptoms from cannabis. I had how do you call it, like a balance week, like smoke less. Oh my god, hot sweats and everything. Have anybody of you ever experienced this? It's kind of intense. I had to really Google, like, what, weed withdrawal, is that a thing? It's definitely a thing. It's crazy how much I sweated and how much I dreamt, and I couldn't sleep, and it's crazy. just for not smoking for a little bit. But the discussion, political discussion, is very often based on just a lack of education. So, yes, keep talking about it wherever you live, and then hopefully educate people. Can I say the name of the guy again? I want to read up on this. I think we're slow. Oh, his name is Charles Brent, the missionary. The missionary in the Philippines. Charles Brent. It's really, as a journalist historian, I can totally nerd out on it, and it's dope because hardly anybody has ever looked into it. So sometimes you hit history, and like every word that you write about it is sort of like, I am one of the first people to ever write this down. How the fuck is it possible that I am one of the first? But it's, there's a few books written about Charles Brent from sort of like Christian history, because he was a monumental, this figure, Charles Brent, was a monumental figure in the Episcopalian Church in America at the time, which had huge influence. If there ever was a national church in the U.S., it was the Episcopalian Church around that time, and he had a direct line with presidents. So from that, he's been called a tireless crusader for Christ and stuff like that. He definitely was. And so his opium, his part in the opium treaties, or the fact that it was all his idea, is usually just mentioned as sort of like a byline in his biography, but hardly ever is it approached from drug war history. So it's really fun. Thank you, Critic, that my MDMA video was useful for you. Yeah, I think I should move towards a bunch of practical videos also again, right? Like all this policy stuff, it's super high level and it can be super boring. I love it, and I think it's very important that we talk about it, even though sometimes it can be boring. I'm trying to make it interesting, funny. Like I try to make it at least lighthearted. But I understand that these practical videos can also really be helpful. Sometimes, please send me feedback. I'm also on Twitter and I'm on Instagram, Thijs Roes, sometimes spelled with IJ, the Dutch way, or sometimes spelled with a Y. You can always add me somewhere and send me messages, give me feedback, because that way I know much better. Like, I this whole head is filled with all this bunch of info, and sometimes it's really great if people, through questions or just by shining a light on a certain topic, make sure that I know what's important to you all. So, M says cannabis must be decriminalized internationally. Yeah, definitely. It's on the books, that it's on the UN books, that it is as dangerous as crack cocaine and heroin. And I think you have to work all the way from that high level UN stuff. We went there. These meetings are some of the most boring meetings you ever have to sit through. So it's really, it's really, you need a lot of dedication to change these laws. Portugal going to introduce a 19% THC, 90% CBD strain in pharmacies. And they didn't say what is what. That is weird. Stefan, thank you for the like. I haven't said, like, of course, if you like this video, I should have said that. See, that's why this stream is still in beta. I should answer questions at the end. That's one thing I thought about. I should call out for a like earlier, right, guys? And maybe my Patreon shout out should be more visual, something, I don't know, with a puppet jumping around, something like that. Oh, Charles, yes, Charles Brent is his name. Missionary. Yeah, he's the moral founder of the drug war. With that, people, I think I'm gonna call it a night. This went a lot better than some of my previous lives, although I had some difficulties at the beginning. Keep an eye out for next week. The first version of my documentary will be, in whatever way, like even with gaps or whatever, will be uploaded to Patreon. So my Patreon supporters will get a preview and room for feedback on the documentary for last changes. Then I'm going on holiday. Before that time, I'm also going to release the first podcasts. So stay tuned for that. You can find them then on Twitter and probably also through a YouTube post. So that's all going to happen in the next 10 days. The documentary I'm going to release after I get through all the feedback, and then will be released around a month from now. So, with that, I hope you welcome me back to the YouTubes. This is going to be an exciting time, daunting, but fun. And with your support, I shall persevere. We shall all persevere, and we'll keep on all talking about how to use drugs for good, and how to end the war on drugs, and how to do this all safely in an open, normal way. And to grow this conversation, and to teach you more about the wonders of the universe in general, because I love the wonders of the universe. Yes, free the base, Elias. Switzerland has an excellent methadone program which has totally helped to get rid of the criminality and informed the Dutch methadone and heroin program. Without the Swiss, that would have not happened. So, thank you, Switzerland. And with that, I bid you all farewell, and go watch the game if you want to. See you!